when you're ready.
Great. Okay. Good morning. Thank you for being here. We're really excited to share with you what we've been working on for the last few months in our Inclusive Economic Development Lab course with Professor Cooney at the Yale School of Management. We so appreciate that you've taken a moment out of your days to join us. So my name is Faye Phillips. I'm a first-year student at the Yale School of Management, and I'll let my classmates introduce themselves as well.
I'm Sarah Olaminik. I'm a first year at the Jackson School.
And I'm Brandon Jones, a first-year MBA student at the Yale School of Management.
Great. Okay. So the structure of our presentation today will take the following shape. We'll begin by grounding ourselves in the histories of the Armory that must be pulled through into any redevelopment of the space. And from there, we'll discuss our approach to the project and then talk through our analysis of the development process as it relates to the Armory. We'll provide some possible funding sources and related use scenarios, and then conclude with our recommendations for specific next steps. Then we look forward to the opportunity to answer any questions and discuss further with all of you. Okay, so let's begin by grounding ourselves in the informative history of the Goffe Street Armory. We learned from Elihu and Nadine about this incredible building in the center of our city at the crossroads of several neighborhoods, standing as a magnificent gathering space. So while it's currently in need of significant repair, for most of its 92-year history, it has served as a major center of community life. While constructed in 1930 to be the home of the Connecticut National Guard, it's important to remember that the Armory was intended to serve more purposes than just military use. The Armory hosted exhibitions of every sort. We heard about the boat shows, the dog shows, the antique shows, concerts, dances, inaugural balls, conferences, community events. So we just want to highlight that it was a gathering space from its inception. And among the most notable of community events at the Armory were the Black Expos of the 1970s. The Expo supported the civic programs of the Black Coalition of Greater New Haven, featuring African-American business and culture and attracting over 30,000 people. And after a period of dormancy from 2009 to 2012, the Armory once again bustled with activity and art and community when former executive director Helen Cowder with the arts nonprofit ArtSpace organized an annual Armory weekend as part of citywide open studios until the building's condemnation in 2018. So ArtSpace hosted incredible large-scale community art exhibitions, and in doing so demonstrated how activating the Armory in this way can create continuity with its history as a multi-purpose, civic-oriented structure that holds a central place in community life. So we highlight these histories because they can be pulled forward into the adaptive reuse process and also into the financing of its revitalization. So Elihu and Nadine and the Armory Community Advisory Committee have held multiple community envisioning events, which have demonstrated that there is no shortage of ideas for uses of the Armory space. Helen has also created space for public engagement on the subject, as was on display during citywide open studios at Elihu's interactive exhibit, Excavating the Armory in 2017. And so through documentation of these events, we saw incredible enthusiasm and desire to rehabilitate this building so that it may once again be the civic jewel in the community. And I'll pause just for a moment to give you a chance to digest this little wheel of all sorts of ideas. And so you can see the appetite for redevelopment is here, but the question that continues to resurface is, how do we pay for it? So this is the central question of our team's project.
I'm sorry.
So you asked us to look into how to pull
What?
together
No, not yet. When you're
financing for this
dusty,
unique
so
asset.
do
And so
your
we
thing.
dove
We'll do it
in,
later.
approaching the question from several directions.
So we took 3 approaches to begin to answer the question of what a comprehensive financing model for Armory redevelopment would look like. We started out with the studies of comparable projects and past precedents. Then we moved on to an analysis of the development process as a whole. And then finally, we explored some possibilities for local or regional funding sources that might be appropriate for use at the Armory, depending on what the ultimate use case looks like. So we started with the precedent studies. First, we tried to better understand the existing data on the redevelopment process and the funding structures of the Armory precedents that had already been collected by past teams. So we reviewed the 16 completed or in progress Armory redevelopment projects that we had data on, and you can see them listed here. And then after that initial analysis, we moved into 3 deeper case studies of various reuse projects. So you can see here, these are just a few of the examples of different graphics we created based on the available data of those 16 armories. We analyzed different cross sections, and we have a spreadsheet with that data compiled that can be shared in this presentation. So these are some of our sample graphics. Some of the key themes we explored included the period of renovation, the size of the armory, whether it was larger than or smaller than 100,000 square feet. We looked at the different funding sources, whether there was public funds, private funds, the use cases, and whether it had national registry status. These pie charts were useful as a first step in understanding what Armory redevelopment processes could look like, but they take us only so far. After this initial analysis, it became clear that there was no single funding strategy that was more common than another. In each case, the redevelopment strategy for the selected armory was highly context dependent. It was also difficult to obtain firm numbers on redevelopment funding amounts from each source, which made quantitative analysis of each redevelopment process very challenging. We do know that state funding was very often included in the redevelopment process, and that armories as large as Goffe Street have been successfully redeveloped. And those takeaways are listed here for your reference. One of those armories as large as Goffe Street that was successfully redeveloped was the subject of our next subsection of this approach, which was diving deeper into the redevelopment process using 3 case studies. So in the absence of a clear, broad trend, we took 3 examples that we felt might be relevant for Goffe Street and did a deeper dive to really try to understand their redevelopment processes. So the first one that was a large armory was the Bedford Union Armory. And that's a redevelopment project that's spread across 3 different buildings, and it's over 500,000 gross square feet, which is larger even than the Goffe Street Armory, which is about 150,000. In this case, the city is leasing the property to a private developer, and it was initially going to be developed as a mix of affordable housing and market rate condos, but the negotiations over the exact proportions turned out to be too contentious, and the decision was ultimately made to develop it as 100% affordable housing. The second case study we examined was the West Newton Armory. That was identified as ideal for affordable housing from the start. It's much smaller than Goffe Street. It's only about 50,000 square feet. The planning and redevelopment process was very much city-led. They put out an RFP, which received 7 proposals, and the winning one was made by a nonprofit developer, and that's under development now. And then finally, we also looked at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, which isn't an armory, but it is another large former military establishment that's being redeveloped. It's being led by the Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation, a public-private development corporation. It's a major development park. It has over 1,200 acres of land. There are over 120 companies that are locating there in various office spaces, and they utilize a variety of tax credits and incentives to entice companies to locate within the Navy Yard. In addition to being an opportunity zone, which is a tax incentive that would be available in New Haven, they also have the designation of innovation zone, which carries additional benefits. The Navy Yard also made use of $15 million in special CPACE funding, which is designated for renewable energy improvements, in which we'll talk more about it in a little bit. So these case studies offered us a glimpse into the process of development and the context-specific ways that redevelopment was achieved. However, since each case was so unique, Goffe Street Armory appears unlikely to follow the same path as any of these individual models. So our takeaways from that were essentially that these processes really are very context dependent, and the capital stack in every case was compiled based on the context specific realities of that Armory redevelopment project. So having established that, we moved on to our next approach, which was to examine the development process in more detail and see what that might look like at Goffe Street.
After seeing the various ways that development can come to fruition, we realized that we needed to take a step back to better understand the process. So this is our second approach, where we took a dive into the development process. The real estate development process can be thought of in 5 basic stages: concept, approvals, design, construction, and sales. At the end of the concept stage, a developer will have a team, a concept design, a pro forma, potential investors and lenders, a preliminary indication of support from the city and other relevant stakeholders, and a good idea of the market's appetite for the development. In approvals, developers continue to meet with city staff, politicians, community groups, neighbors, investors, lenders, and others. They solicit and incorporate feedback into their design. Hopefully, at the end of this 1 to 2 year phase, the city's planning and zoning commissions grant approval for the project to be built. The design stage is a bit of a misnomer, and that it should be thought of as the detail stage. Every team member is refining their estimates for cost and pricing of the development. Then we have about 2 years for construction, and lastly, we go into sales. This is the stage where the building gets leased up. And the key takeaway from the sales stage is that the development is not a light switch. It takes time for it to ramp up to full operation. Stating the obvious to you all, but we're here in the concept phase, which we explored through information interviews. The interviews provided us with both operator and funder perspectives. For our first information interview, we spoke with the former executive director of ArtSpace, Helen Cowder. She shared with us fond memories of the Armory as an incredible, engaging structure and a central gathering space for the local community. For a number of years, the Armory was a key piece of ArtSpace's citywide open studios. It accommodated hundreds of artists and guests, and the drill hall provided a particularly unique space for performance artists to engage with that was pretty exciting. Helen took a central view of the neighborhood when thinking about the Armory with this. She illustrated it as a campus of complementary activities and a community-centered vision. You have Hill House High School, Prescott Bush, Bethel AME, some Habitat for Humanity rehabbed homes, housing projects, and correctional facilities, to name a few. Within this campus context, the Armory is situated at a crossroads for the city. It can honestly serve many purposes, not just for the arts. And so maintaining it as a community asset should be a top priority. Regarding funding, Helen's instinct suggested that there would not be enough local art philanthropy to take on the redevelopment on its own. So some sort of national appeal would likely be necessary to attract outside dollars to the development. Even then, funding follows great ideas. So a strong programmatic vision is necessary to attract funding. Our next information interview led us to the social investment director of a major national foundation headquartered in the Midwest, though he's a graduate of Southern, so he's familiar with New Haven. In contrast to our interview with Helen, he was more inclined to think that a national philanthropic organization would actually take a back seat on a development such as the Goffe Street Armory for a couple of reasons. One, many foundations simply do not get involved with project financing, making few exceptions only for projects with some deep meaning or tie to the organization. For two, large foundations are focused on proving concepts and scaling their impact, whereas our Armory would be viewed as a one-off development. That said, there could be opportunities for funding later in the development if there was alignment with one of the foundation's programmatic focus areas. His perspective on funding for the Armory was quite optimistic. The Armory's location has a valuable opportunity to couple historic tax credits and new market tax credits that could heavily subsidize the development. Solar development is another interesting funding source he mentioned, as he's been seeing increased project development activity with the Connecticut Green Bank, albeit this would be a minor portion of the capital stack. And given his belief that a national org would take a back seat, local philanthropy would likely need to take the lead to jumpstart development, particularly someone with a vested interest in New Haven. All said, an idea that our conversation kept circling back to, though, was that purpose matters. In his experience, you really can't say, tell us what you'll finance and that's what we'll do. That just leaves too much ambiguity and conveys minimal conviction towards a process that will certainly encounter headwinds and require deep commitment. A community-informed concept is a must. Our third information interview put us in conversation with an impact developer who used to live in New Haven, which was actually kind of a crash course on property analysis through the eyes of a developer. It was pretty incredible. He was zooming around on Google Maps, checking out the neighborhood, asking questions about other developments in the area, while also assessing the Armory's exterior and interior. He was energized by the space and could immediately envision it filled with a mix of creative studio spaces and also office spaces for community organizations. The big open space presented by the drill hall can be a blessing and a curse though. On one hand, it provides opportunities to activate the space, while on the other, it's such an awesome space that it requires priority and can't be put on the back burner during development. The Armory's bones and windows appear to be in good shape, which is consistent with pursuing historic preservation and potential use as creative studios and office spaces. Though given the surrounding area and minimal parking, offices may make sense only for a small number of users. In providing his perspective on funding, he ran us through some considerations of redeveloping for affordable housing and redeveloping for office and studio space. Similar to what we heard in the other interviews, there are not a lot of philanthropic dollars flowing for historic preservation. Further, housing will require heavy subsidy and residential requirements present a higher remediation bar than commercial spaces. So from arts operator to philanthropy to creative studio development, the overarching theme and point to be driven home from these interviews is that concept matters. The concept is what allows you to connect with potential funders and build traction.
So having looked at the development phase, we decided that even knowing that use was still up in the air, we wanted to model what financing could look like under different scenarios. And so we decided to look at what potential funding sources could be for the Armory that might vary depending on the use case. So we started with the three most common funding questions, which were, where do we get the funding to remediate the building? Where do we get the funding to redevelop the Armory? And then what kind of revenue could we expect to generate from the Armory? But each of these questions brought us back to that initial question that's bolded here of planning and assessment, which is how do we get the funding to get the Armory to the starting point for redevelopment and remediation? So our exploration of the development process led us to model when the different funding sources enter the development process. First, as you can see, planning and assessment funding is required to be able to identify the desired use and assess the remediation and redevelopment costs. Afterwards, all three remaining buckets of funding can be identified, with remediation and redevelopment funding entering the process first, and then the revenue sources being realized once redevelopment is completed. So we'll walk through each of these phases. A successful planning process would need to encompass several elements. There would need to be a formalized steering committee that be recognized both by community stakeholders and potential funders as legitimate and representative of community needs and perspectives. The committee, in consultation with other stakeholders, would need to identify an use that aligns with what community priorities are for the space and for the neighborhood. So that's the concept and stakeholders section of the planning side. On the logistical side, the planning and assessment process should also complete an environmental phase 1 study and finalize a cost estimate of what the remediation costs would be and the redevelopment costs in order for the process to move forward. The Spiegel's report did give us some initial figures on what remediation costs might look like, but those numbers were incomplete, and the time since the report was conducted means that those figures have likely changed. So the details on what we were able to gather on current remediation costs can be found in an appendix to this presentation, but regardless, further assessment is going to be necessary to confirm the validity of those figures or adjust them appropriately. Now, there are a variety of funding options for this process. The Armory's known asbestos issues may be sufficient to qualify it for a brownfield planning grant from the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development, which could be in the amount of up to $200,000 and could cover various costs associated with the planning process and remediation assessments. Its historic registry status as well could unlock funding from the Department of Economic and Community Development survey and planning grants, and those can also be used to supplement the planning process. Then outside of state funding, there could be other sources of private or public philanthropic funds that could be used in this stage if desired. Another option that would need to be evaluated during the planning phase is the ownership and governance structure. And that would have to be determined early on in order for an appropriate capital stack to be developed. There are a variety of options that could be considered that might be appropriate for the Armory. One is a neighborhood trust or conservancy in which the property is placed in a trust and overseen by a local advisory board or steering committee. Another option is ownership by a developer or a private investor. And then there are variations on city ownership and governance. The Armory could be maintained and owned entirely by the city as a public asset, or it could be leased to the developer for a minimal fee, while the city ultimately retains ownership and has some authority in terms of what happens at the Armory. Once the planning process is completed and the governance structure is established, the rest of the funding model can be determined. So the next funding sources to enter the process will be for remediation and redevelopment. While the functional uses of remediation and redevelopment funding may be distinct in practice, they're likely to be compiled and used simultaneously. The distinction may be most important for certain funding sources that can be restricted to only one or the other of these uses. The exact funding stack needed to redevelop the Armory is going to be highly dependent on the use, but these are a few examples of potential funding sources that could be used in various scenarios to help redevelop and remediate the Armory. So you can see a couple of state grants. Again, the Armory may qualify for the Brownfield Municipal Grant Program, which could offer funding for remediation. There's other state grants as well, like the Connecticut Communities Challenge grant that could be appropriate depending on the ultimate identified use of the Armory. There's the option for private investors such as Shift Capital. There would be tax credits that could cover part of the cost depending on what that use would be. So the historic tax credits, which would be projected to cover about 18% of redevelopment costs, but of course those come with restrictions on the kind of use and particularly around what happens with the exterior of the building. There are additional use-specific tax credits that could apply depending on the use scenario. There's the Opportunity Zone credits, which don't have a limit, but could come with higher pressure from the investors to provide high profit returns. And so that would need to be balanced against other priorities at the Armory. Depending on the structure, new market tax credits could potentially draw investment by allowing investors to get a tax credit for making equity investments in certified community development entities. And then finally, low-income housing tax credits could be estimated to recoup about 9% of the costs, but would come with the added financial burden of requiring additional remediation and potentially the loss of the historic tax credits due to the extensive structural changes that would need to be made in order to create livable housing units. So other funding options include loans or other financing options through the state or municipality. There appears to be a lot of energy right now around renewable energy modifications, and investing in solar or other energy efficient upgrades could open up significant financing opportunities for redevelopment. And that was something that came up in our informational interviews as well as in our case study of the Navy Yard as an option that could be really relevant for a variety of potential uses of the Armory. So after the remediation and redevelopment, we need to move into looking at the revenue model. And the revenue model is going to depend upon whatever the community approved use and desired path to redevelopment of the Armory is. The objective of the revenue model is twofold. Ideally, it will have a community contribution, either in terms of the atmosphere that it provides, the public assets that it allows to remain, job opportunities, or other benefits. And in addition to this, it should help offset the cost of redevelopment and contribute to the ongoing maintenance costs and sustainability associated with building upkeep. The potential revenue models listed on this slide are purely to spark imagination. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list. These are just a few of the examples that have arisen through past community engagements by the ACAC, listed in the Spiegels report, and through our own informational interviews. Absent a stakeholder agreement on the specific use, we chose to model just a few of the many possibilities and to provide some back of the envelope examples and templates that could be used in future discussions and in planning processes to confirm both an use and a financing structure for the Armory.
All right, so some of you are probably familiar with this schematic. This is of the Armory from the Spiegels report. And really, it's a unique structure. And from previous School of Architecture student work, we saw that there was considerable variability between the conditioned and unconditioned spaces throughout the building. So given this, we went to the Spiegels inventory to match the spaces with potential uses to more accurately inform our financing projections. Using the existing layout through the development also aligns our historic preservation and cost minimization interest. All right, so this might look a little busy, but to orient you, so there are 3 main levels, and we're going from the ground level on the left side to the second level in the middle, and then the third level on the right. So this baseline layout gives an overview of the main 3 levels. We can see that there are 4 large assembly spaces and 1 large gymnasium denoted in pink. We have 2 kitchens on the ground level denoted in purple, 1 large storage area on the ground level in gray, and then about 64,000 square feet of office space spread across the 3 levels in that light blue. The first use case we'll talk through is for mixed use, which should require the least amount of development as it is largely using the space that's currently laid out. There are 3 primary revenue drivers in this scenario. 1, office and studio space, 2, event space, and 3, kitchen space. From our developer interview, we'd expect prime office space on the New Haven Green to go for upwards of $30 per square foot, and studio space to be near $20 per square foot. However, as you move away from the green, spaces command lower rents. To establish comparables, we found office spaces that are currently for rent and studio spaces at places such as Rector Square and Crown Bell's property on Shelton Avenue to establish a conservative range of $10 to $13 for leasing our office and studio space. For event spaces, we found a variety of venues and used their off-peak pricing. For kitchen space, City Seed actually has both incubator and commercial kitchens that we conservatively benchmarked off of using their mid to lower end rates and usage. We applied these conservative rents to the existing square footage for each use. We assumed no additional revenue from parking or the 1 residential unit on the 3rd level. So through mixed use, we project annual income of just under $600,000 per year. You can see that in the top middle of the screen. And so here's an overview of what the development and operational financing could look like for the Armory in the mixed use. Up top, we have the sources and uses of funds. For the uses on the right, you can see remediation and repurposing cost at approximately $11 million and down payment for a loan at $1.25 million, totaling about $12.5 million. On the left, you can see the sources to pay for those costs. Grant funding for remediation, historical tax credits for rehabilitation and preservation, some debt financing in the form of a loan, and lastly, to see that there's a gap of about $3.8 million that would need to come from other sources, whether it be philanthropy or investors. Below that is a summary pro forma showing the income and expenses of our mixed use model, which leaves us with a profitable development of $86,000 per year. At the other end of the spectrum is a much more involved redevelopment, resulting in low-income affordable housing. In this use, the assembly and office spaces have all been converted to livable spaces, and the 4th floor residential unit is also included. Using affordable housing guidelines, the rent multiplier was based on tenants earning 60% of the area median income of $73,000 per year. This resulted in similar revenues as the mixed-use development at just over $600,000 per year. Of note, in this development's sources and uses is that the residential development costs are higher than for commercial spaces. And also our outside investment gap comes in at $7 million. In the pro forma, you see that the housing development is also profitable. Side by side, I want to highlight a few things in the sources and uses. 1, development costs are about 66% higher than the mixed use because the bar is higher than commercial spaces. You can't just seal off areas as you would be able to in commercial space. 2, due to the extensive development in the housing, we're no longer able to tap historical tax credits in a meaningful way, but we unlocked low-income housing tax credits. Even so, as previously noted, our outside investment gap has nearly doubled, coming in at $7 million. In the pro forma, you see similar incomes between the uses, but the profits of the housing development are less than half of the mixed use development. This is because the operating expenses of housing are higher than commercial spaces because they're not shared. As like a residential tenant doesn't share the same cost as like a commercial tenant in these uses. These operating expenses are considerably higher than the comparable armories we studied. And just to reemphasize, this is a back of the envelope calculation. And then also note in this financing, you don't see an acquisition fee, which can vary widely, but assuming the developer and the city agree to keep the armory in part as a community asset, then we'll project the acquisition at $1. And that's the financing comparison. All right, stepping back from the numbers, we can summarize a few benefits and costs of each model. In the mixed use model, the benefits center on the ability for the community to access and govern the space. It would also allow the historic memories and uses to be honored. By keeping the drill hall public, its history can be preserved and shared with future generations of New Haveners. The mixed use model is also resilient as its revenue model draws from a range of incomes. As for cost, in a place like New Haven, where there's so much need, it is politically difficult to justify the investment in creative studio space or mixed use purposes at the expense of other needs. That being said, the mixed use approach would require the least amount of work to bring the building back into service. As for the pros of turning the Armory into low-income housing, there is demonstrable need for affordable housing in the neighborhood where the Armory is located. The location lends itself well to housing, and it would provide a reliable stream of income. In contrast, with the low-income housing model, governance does not stay with the community, and the community may lose access to the special space. Further, the building would require much higher costs to convert the office and assembly spaces into housing, and residential uses must meet a higher remediation threshold. Lastly, while a low-income housing developer could get creative with the drill hall, it's not immediately clear how to maximize the use of that space, especially with like the housing units like lining, like being on the outside of the building. For the building, so we've touched on a few of the pros and cons throughout, but just to bring them together, the Armory is beautifully constructed and sits within a culturally rich community. It's situated near some exciting developments in Next Haven and the soon-to-be Dixwell Plaza. Its challenges are parking and some use limitations that come with its location as we consider the different revenue models.
So based on everything we have learned from our research, we would like to recommend some concrete next steps for launching the redevelopment process. The first of these recommendations is to launch a formal planning process. So as Sarah spoke to earlier, in order to decide on a use, the city should formalize a state-recognized steering committee that has legitimacy both for the local community and for potential funders. And once a community is formed, we recommend that the community apply for a Department of Economic and Community Development planning grant, like we mentioned the brownfield, for example, to tackle a host of activities required in the concept phase of development. That's the environmental phase 1 assessment, a rehabilitation cost assessment, community canvassing, and working to refine the specific uses even further. So the national philanthropist that we spoke to provided us with a metaphor for forming the steering committee. He said, think of it as setting the table. So here we have several community members, local philanthropists, maybe someone like Gary Winfield, a state senator, a consultant hired through a planning grant, and perhaps some semi-retired attorneys or bankers from New Haven, and a city official. He mentioned these kinds of actors to us as members of the steering committee who may be interested in moving the project forward. His advice was to gather a group of people from across sectors who are heavily invested in New Haven, meet monthly, and formalize the process with a planning grant that can pay for a consultant to push for progress on a variety of fronts mentioned earlier. The steering committee should also consider governance structure for the redeveloped Armory. We've heard again and again that the drill hall is a space of public possibility. And so the committee should think about what kinds of governance structure would ensure this public access. You know, a 99-year lease to a private developer with stipulations for public access to the drill hall versus governance held by a neighborhood conservancy would inform how the capital stack is put together. Which leads me to our final recommendation, which is to pull together the capital stack. Again, as you heard earlier, landing on a specific use is essential before building a stack to fund the renovations. From there, the steering committee can build out a sources and uses of funds statement and find an anchor funder who cares deeply about the city and wants to take on this project. Finally, it will be important to take advantage of the various tax credits and subsidies associated with the use and the building itself. We discussed these earlier: historic status tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, new market tax credits, energy efficiency incentives. And with that, we're hopeful that these recommendations will be an effective roadmap to launching the redevelopment process for the Armory. And this is where we will conclude our presentation. But before we do that, I just want to say that the future appears bright for the Armory. And it's really been a pleasure for all of us. We're heartened by the enthusiasm that this iconic building generates from such a huge range of actors. And we know that all of you have invested so much work, and it's clear that that has not been for nothing. The investors, the nonprofit leaders, the experienced impact developers we spoke to truly share your excitement and actually think this process could be fairly straightforward. So we hope our research will serve you well, and we look forward to following the efforts. So with that, we'd like to thank you again for this opportunity to work on this amazing project and open up the space for questions and discussion.